Epilogue. With a final, tedious swing, the 7-pound pickaxe wedged itself deep into the gap between boulders, sending a shock through Leigh's exhausted arms, down her spine, clear to her toes, wrenching her torso and legs, straining to pry the slabs apart with all her remaining strength. She wished for the extra power belligerent screaming and cursing would have given her. If only she still had her voice. Microscopically, the rock gave. Enough to drive her on. Mud cracked like tearing fabric. The upper slab budged, rising like the arm of a mammoth bridge. Finally, it rolled free, tumbling over twice, slamming into place 15 feet down the slope, with a dense thud and a puff of dust. The result of a half-day's work, bringing her 5 feet nearer to breaking through the vent in the hill to the temple of the beast. Gazing across the golden African sand ocean reaching to an empty horizon, she felt it seemed all too familiar, in no way welcome, and somehow entirely new. The biggest change this time being Leigh was completely alone. No Casey, no Raythians, no Joseph, just her and endless hills of sand. Arriving 5 days prior, prepared to fight her way through hordes of murderous, dogmatic tribespeople, Leigh had found Gehenna deserted. The 3-axle truck she'd rented, with a 10-foot rear storage container, was not only loaded with tools for digging and blasting, like dynamite, but also for defense, including toxic gas grenades, 4 cases of ammo, and 2 brand spankin' new Daewoo Precision Industries K3 machine guns. Happy she didn't have to use them, Leigh still felt much safer keeping the weapons around, just in case the Raythians decided to return, though the possibility seemed unlikely after more than 14 months. The camp that had once belonged to her and her crew was desolate upon her arrival, nearly devoured by the Chadian desert. The mouth of the canyon leading to the Gehenna cave entrance had somehow been mysteriously blocked by a newly fallen rock of colossal proportions, shaped like a cylinder. Dried blood was splattered across its face like train car graffiti. Working her way into the canyon, Leigh found the temple cave entrance gone, reduced to a slanted pile of rubble. It felt as if the universe were pointing with an infinite number of middle fingers, laughing at her with galaxy-sized buck teeth. Following a futile day spent trying to clear the blockage, it became brutally clear that she would not be getting into the temple, as it was likely the system had caved in all the way to the dead stairs. Leigh's trek to Africa was a bust, it seemed. Distraught, nearly brought to her knees with a desire to punch something, she began the return trip, feeling the need for a tail to tuck between her legs. But soon after leaving, as Leigh was gazing over a vista on the truck's right-hand side, she saw what appeared to be a freshwater river flowing into the distant hills. I couldn't be hallucinating already. Upon closer inspection, the river became long tracks of unnatural glass streaking westward. The substance was murky, and none of her tools had yet to make a dent in it. Tracing the glass road, Leigh discovered its origin upon a hill riddled with deep fissures. At its center, heaps of broken rock rested over what appeared to be a 10-yard hole punctured through the crust of the earth. Rifts in the hillsides snaked out from the breach, hundreds of yards in every direction. The location of the collapsed vent seemed too perfectly in line with the tunnel system that led to the temple. Leigh had walked it more than 100 times. She knew every twist and turn. It couldn't be a coincidence. The statue of the beast was directly below her feet. She would have bet the farm. Though it was impossible to know how far down, as she hadn't packed any radar sensors. Didn't even have space for wet wipes. Following the glass trail outward on the second day, Leigh hiked into a deep, rocky area saturated in reds and browns. Huge outcrops and cliffs rose in all directions as she approached the summit. Where the glass trail went, nothing stood for yards around it, carved away by some radical force of nature. In a long stretch, shadowed by high walls on either side, she felt as though she were walking in a huge sewer tunnel with an open top, its sides smooth and charred. As the protuberances dwindled away, opening up for the blue and white sky churning above, Leigh came upon half a mountainside lying in ruin on a broken cliff's edge. The path's end. This is where it happened, whatever it was. But we're still here. Joseph failed. For now, at least. More assured than ever she was doing the right thing, Leigh hurried back to the cracked hill. If the creatures invading her world had this kind of power, what else could they do? Time was of the essence. She parked the truck, set camp, and got to work clearing the collapsed vent, her shortcut to the temple. Hardly noticing if she was shivering, boiling, or sweating, she pressed on, despite any human need or weakness. With each passing second, the obstructed hole grew more likely to give out beneath her in a deadly cascade. Yet Leigh felt no need for a helmet, rope, or harness. So far, it's been fine. Nothing to worry about. She lightly tapped the slab beneath her with the tip of her boot, for some form of meager reassurance. See? The closer she got to breaking through the obstruction, the more Leigh believed the prize was nearby, waiting to be found. The one thing that could level the playing field if someone like Joseph ever surfaced again. Nearly a year of research had all but confirmed the Raytheon dagger was much more than a device for sacrificing innocents. But of course she wouldn't know what it was truly capable of without a chance to test the weapon. The return mission to Gehenna was one of retrieval, based only on a hypothesis, backed only by conjecture. But if she was right, pretty sure I am, Leigh could stand to inherit incredible power of her own. Presently, hoisting the pickaxe with every intention of continuing, she stumbled and had to catch herself from falling. There was no fighting it. After spending 3 hours this morning with an electric jackhammer, and then 2 more with a pickaxe, she needed a breather. Removing her dusty, wide-brimmed hat, she wiped her forehead with her shirt sleeve. Once white, now stained a mixture of cream, brown, and whatever yellowish color sweat was. Leaning against the truck, she took a drink and opened a nutrient bar. Strawberry cream. And set her watch alarm for 10 minutes. The water was ice cold and refreshing. The only thing she made sure to bring in excess, inside an 80-gallon tank with a solar-powered refrigeration unit. Every drop had been carefully accounted for. It seemed Casey's persnickety, fastidious bookkeeping habits had finally worn off on the professor. Casey. Thinking of her slowed Leigh's heart, and also made it heavy with burden. Leaving Casey behind was one of the most difficult things she had ever done. But no one could know about Leigh's return to Gehenna. Especially not Casey. If she found out, she would surely follow, and the job had already proven itself far too dangerous for Leigh's former assistant. Even if things went right, The journey would only get worse. Leigh had put her through enough danger.
Never again.
Casey belonged someplace with pillows, friends, and hot cocoa. Leigh belonged in nature, wearing gloves, covered in dirt. She thought of the night she'd lost her voice, the night she'd seen
God-damned
demons with her own eyes, floating through the trees around her parents' cabin, the night she truly lost all sense of what was possible and what wasn't. She and Casey had stayed as long as they could, but with no food, water, gas, or power. One night was enough to prove they could not remain any longer. The only comfort the cabin provided, once they'd broken inside, were 3 scratchy, moldy blankets and a slanted, rotting couch. Spending hours shivering, thinking, hoping, praying someone might rescue them, they'd faced the ultimate disappointment when the sun rose, and no one had come. The entire night, Casey repeated the same tired lines. "Don't worry, they're coming. They're good people."
Blah, blah, blah.
But they didn't, and they weren't. The snowmobile Leigh's father had left in the shed worked, but its fuel gauge read only half full. Not enough to get them to Red Lodge, but it was their only shot. Following a brief deliberation, they decided they would test their luck. Fighting through the woods for 2 solid hours, the snowmobile eventually puttered and died, forcing the duo to hike the remaining 5 or 6 miles, crossing feet-high banks of snow and flurries of ice-cold wind stinging their cheeks like tiny needles. A half-day later, after losing the trail twice, doubling back, and damn near being stricken with frostbite, Leigh and Casey arrived at the outskirts of town. The first building they came upon was the sheriff's station, which seemed like a miraculous blessing at the time. The small bit of joy Leigh found was quickly set aside once it became clear the deputies inside were going to be anything but helpful. One, a lanky 20-something named Elvis, in a uniform 2 sizes too small. The other, an elderly man named Bill, with a forehead shimmering like morning sun on the Atlantic, were as inept and unorganized as their lopsided badges and coffee-stained coats suggested. Leigh assumed she and Casey would be out of there in no time, scot-free, perhaps with a free ride into town. Then her petite friend proceeded to tell the truth. They'd been teleported to Montana by spirit warrior people and almost witnessed the end of the world at the hands of a demon in a hockey mask. If she'd had her voice in that moment, there were a few things Leigh would have said to Casey. But instead she was forced to watch as Bill and Elvis fought to contain their juvenile laughter. Of course, the tall tale was not believed, which at first seemed like a lucky break, though once again Leigh's optimism proved to be misplaced, when Casey began to mention Jeff, the Scotsman. On a whim, Bill, the diligent one apparently, put Jeff's full name into an international missing persons database and got a hit. Jeff's family had listed him missing the week prior. The deputies, suddenly all ears, detained and questioned Leigh and Casey separately for hours as to Jeff Clatcher's whereabouts and the mysterious band of people who claimed to be from another world. For the first time, Leigh's muteness came in handy, though it would not be the last. Unable to incriminate herself, she spent most of her time in the room shaking her head, in the end directing them to the wrinkled business card she'd received from the anonymous donor who'd funded the African dig in the first place, amazingly still in her pocket, along with her ID and 2 credit cards. It was likely they would find no answers, but she secretly hoped the Red Lodge Sheriff's Department might prove useful in identifying the woman, whom Leigh knew only as Aluka. She very much wanted to pay her former financier a visit.
Just gonna have a nice, friendly chat. Promise.
After 27 hours, and 6 threatening phone calls from Leigh's lawyer, she and Casey were allowed to leave the cramped, fluorescent-lighted deputy's office with dual citations, free of criminal charges, but under limited surveillance until Jeff's disappearance was solved. They were permitted to fly home, and would then be placed on travel watch lists until further notice. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Casey said, exasperated, as they slumped out of the station the next day, zipping up the thin, ugly plastic jacket Elvis had graciously bestowed upon her. "I mean, with Jeff, it must have been awful to relive all that. And then to have to lie? I just can't imagine." At first, Leigh had no idea what Casey was talking about. Then she remembered the nights she'd spent with Jeff in the tent and felt nothing. There was no heartbreak or sorrowful emptiness for a lost love. No despondency at the thought of never seeing his face again. Shocked by her own lack of remorse, it dawned on Leigh how much she'd changed ever since Joseph, never to be the same. Jeff was a memory, and basic survival dictated moving on. Without blinking, or an ounce of remorse, Leigh nodded and wrote a note to Casey. "Call us a taxi to the airport." Casey's eyes went wide as saucers. "No! We have to get to a hospital! There might be a chance we can save your voice." Wanting to laugh, Leigh instead shook her head vigorously. What Chloe had done was obvious. Leigh's days of speaking were gone for good. No hospital on Earth could do anything about it, but Casey refused to see. As they continued to argue, Leigh made her way to the nearest bus station and bought 2 tickets to Billings. Reluctantly, Casey took the second ticket and followed her. Any possibility of silence during the trip was extinguished by Casey and her excitement to get back to Michigan to stay with her parents, which sounded perfect for her. "They'll be plenty surprised to see me, but also thrilled. They have a spare room, and I can see my brothers and sisters again," she said, as Leigh perused a travel magazine someone left in a seat back pocket.
Can't wait to see the latest trend in fingernail fashion.
"Seriously!" Casey half shrieked. "I don't think either of us should be alone right now. You most of all. You're more than welcome to stay at my mom and dad's. I know you're technically my boss, but we need to be careful. Take it easy, you know? Be around other people. We're just getting started on our road to healing." Sometimes Casey's positivity was hard to stomach. Being around others was the last thing Leigh desired in that moment. All she wanted was a hot bath, a bottle of single malt scotch, heavy metal in her ears, and time to think. When they arrived at Billings Logan International Airport, she took a long while to study the departures board, hoping something would jump out at her. With no winning destinations popping up, going back to London seemed as good an idea as any. She purchased Casey's ticket back to Michigan as a final gift, then her own. When Casey realized they were splitting up, she became slightly less than distraught. Following a long, one-sided discussion, Leigh convinced Casey it was for the best with a final written note, reading, "Please, go home. Need time alone." Casey wiped away a tear and nodded. "Okay, Yeah, sure, she said, wrapping up their woeful goodbye and pretending not to care once she realized she would receive zero reciprocation. Thank you for the ticket, Professor Evans, she said with a final sniff. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be going, and will be taking some time off before seeking new avenues of employment. I appreciate all of the time you have dedicated toward me, and... Ugh, never mind. With a heavy roll of her tired eyes, Casey walked away, never looking back. It took 3 hours for the airport to approve Leigh's travel without a passport.
Which was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't sure they could do that.
The few documents of identification she had helped, but it was a call to the sheriff's office and Elvis's testimony.
Or Bill's. Don't forget Bill.
Which provided the legal legitimacy needed to get her an approval. When she was finally led on a plane, she buckled in and fell asleep before the flight attendants could even begin their safety lecture, sleeping the entire flight home. Assuming the order for psych evaluations from America would never make it overseas, Leigh was surprised when a letter from the law courts upholding the charge came through.
Honestly, didn't expect the systems to be so connected.
But official or not, she'd seen how the deputies had reacted when Casey had told them about Joseph, Mara, Isaiah, and the others. No way Leigh would play the same hand against a professional. The summons, and all others after, went into the trash. When she returned to her flat and life in London, nothing was as Leigh remembered. Every day was a dimmer shade of the one before. Without her voice, the world seemed dead, constrictive and merciless. Her communication with regular citizens was excruciating, and the smug, deaf assholes she did meet from time to time signed way too fast to follow. Not that she didn't understand. Having read a few volumes on ASL and studied dozens of sign language charts, Leigh had already memorized 90% of the motion-based language, including the surprising number of American dialects for English speakers, finding their changes were mostly minor. However, communicating with her hands still felt cumbersome, and she was far too distracted to have any kind of casual conversation anyhow, even if her voice had not been burned away. Try as she might, Leigh could not stop reliving her time with Joseph in her mind. The demon's eyes floating in the trees, the instant transmission of her body over thousands of miles of space, the night she'd endured the void. Most of the first 6 weeks back were spent inside, watching TV and ordering delivery. Cabin fever set in quickly as Leigh grew restless. Thanks in part to the blasé rejoinders the university continued to send every time she requested an assignment, even going so far as to restrict her from returning to the department building to retrieve her personal belongings.
But my cactus is in there.
No firm in town would return her emails, and Leigh had no idea why. It might have been the news of Jeff's disappearance spreading, though that seemed unlikely, as he had been a contract worker out of Scotland.
More likely, the world thinks I need to be protected. Babied.
Reborn as she was, Professor Evans knew of her vulnerability at her core, which had been near shattered, but not broken.
Never broken.
To survive in this world without your greatest weapon was perilous, and without words the professor felt utterly defenseless. Chloe might as well have taken her life. It seemed every day, as the world passed her by, thoughts and notions Leigh had never known found their way in. Actions she would have once called shady, counterproductive, or downright sinister were beginning to gain appeal. For the world was not what you wanted it to be. The world was what it was, and nothing else. One of the lessons she'd learned from Joseph, as sorry as that was. The demon was efficient and effective. He knew his strengths, utilized them, focused on his goal, and came irritatingly close to victory. But the demon did not know his weaknesses, because he did not want to know them, which had surely led to his downfall, whereas Leigh knew hers all too well. As she ventured more into the world, walking the streets, interacting with others, it became clear how often speech was used as a crutch, vomited out for no particular reason. As she adapted and found the secret strengths afforded when one was never expected to speak, Leigh's cynicism and malaise turned into something else. Suddenly, it was clear how much she'd given away in the past by domineering conversations. Words could get you noticed, but knowledge was acquired through listening. For more than a century, government agents had been trained to let silence draw out the truth. With a mute, that meant there was plenty of space to be filled. Casey continued to call and text daily from the States. Occasionally, Leigh would listen to the voice messages, as it was nice to hear her voice and know how she was doing. But she couldn't bring herself to put in the same effort or commiserate. An idea had taken hold in Leigh's mind, and it was growing, with no sign of slowing. A universe had been revealed, where fire dragons spit acid, and warriors from another world with powers too extreme to comprehend existed on Earth since the dawn of time, walking among us as humans. She would find the proof, and the people of Earth would finally know what really happened to their souls when they died, and, with any luck, begin taking steps to fight back against their afterlife oppressors. Turned out the clues were there, hidden in plain sight, spread throughout time. One simply had to know where to start. With no real source for credible data on Earth, and after weeks of searching the internet and libraries of London, Leigh had little more than a few bits of information, most of it hearsay. She would have to leave the country to find what she was truly seeking. Luckily, over the years, she'd gathered a host of useful connections with various universities and libraries across the globe, the keepers of the world's oldest secrets. The safe bet was on one of them being able to provide some kind of information about Joseph, like where he came from, and what other threats such a place could pose to the planet. The only problem was getting out of London without the courts knowing. Jeff's case was still open, and if anyone took a second look at her travel plans, they might get flagged, which could mean Leigh would be grounded. Acquiring a fake passport and identity was the first in a string of crooked steps she'd taken over the last year. When she'd walked away from the warehouse in Stoke-on-Trent, with a manila envelope containing falsified papers, pulling down the brim of her hat and fixing her sunglasses, just in case there were cameras trying to take a peek, a kick of exhilaration had shot through her.
Not gonna lie, I liked it.
Leigh had never dealt with underworld types before, at least not ones who brought shotguns and Rottweilers with them, and stared so intensely into your eyes it seemed they could read your soul. But once she did, she found she wasn't scared for an instant. Even when it came time to purchase the dynamite and guns on the North African black market months later, her hands were as steady as ice. It seemed, after her time with Joseph, nothing would frighten her ever again. Having traveled thousands of miles, visiting 5 countries including Wales, Italy, France, and Sweden, and spending nearly every dime she had, Leigh's search was coming close to an end with next to nothing to show for it. Then, in Nuremberg, Germany, her first breakthrough came. For 3 days, she'd walked the same path to the city library, and for 3 days she'd missed it. Then, on the 4th morning, the day she was due to leave the country, a bronze statue in a grass lot beside a bike path caught her attention. Immediately recognizing the depiction as the eye from the Temple of the Beast, she inspected the sculpture and the plaque underneath, finding its name was Malos. It was donated to the city by an anonymous party.
The demons called Chloe Malos scum.
Some metaphorical digging led Leigh to a single entry for the artwork in the city's public art index. An artist's name, Leigh Monsato. Tracking the steel sculptor to Madrid, Leigh found Monsato. The artist knew nothing of Unearth, but did remember the man who'd commissioned the eye mentioning the word. But that was all. Upon her hiring, Monsato was told it was a requisite public art piece and instructed to do no press for it or answer any questions if someone came calling, though Leigh was the first to do so. Monsato seemed comfortable breaking the deal now, as 26 years had gone by. What's the worst that can happen? When asked if such a demand appeared suspicious at the time, Monsato shrugged. It seemed like a basic, nonpartisan, unoffensive symbol. Didn't think anything of it. Just took the money and did the job. Gotta take what I can get. Monsato then directed Leigh to a website the commissioner of the piece ran, an online broker named Velondir Manor Incorporated. Their website was mostly filled with modern, back-breaking crap for sale at absurd prices, but a few pieces caught Leigh's eye, such as a painting of red eyes glowing in the darkness.
Someone's seen an archfiend or two.
The names of the pieces caught her attention as well. In addition to Malos, she found Eve, Lanwin, Long Live Michael, Long Live Molm Ursuth, Barium Guard, Whist, and many more sprinkled throughout. Beginning a new search using these keywords, Leigh finally found what she'd been waiting for. Turned out, a subculture of unearthed believers existed online.
What doesn't?
Where survivors of encounters with mysterious creatures from a world beyond could swap stories with an audience that would not ridicule them. There were entries about man-sized cocoons hunting people at night in the woods of Georgia, and giant, terrifying jellyfish people who, for hundreds of years, had been taking sailors hostage and sticking tentacles where they don't belong. Though to be fair, few of the latter entries carried a negative tone, and some were even looking to repeat the experience, fervidly, willing to pay good money for it. The pieces of the unearthed puzzle were beginning to come together, but it was not yet a full picture. A miraculous second big break came along while Leigh was visiting her friend and old classmate, Sal Twinsey, in Spain. With little more than blind luck on her side, Leigh discovered handwritten pages in the Senate reading room in Madrid, stuffed inside Volume 3 of the Spiritual Mason's Guidebook, a text of the accounts of the more open-minded of the ancient Freemasons, dating back to the 15th century. No one must have opened the book since the pages had been tucked in there, which she guessed was sometime in the mid-20th century. The pages, written by a Professor Francisco Emul, a botanist from Murcia, who specialized in biophysics and breeding in the mid-19th century, would have seemed like the stories of a poor old man with dementia, easily tossed away, had anyone but Leigh been the one to find them. In the pages, Professor Emul told of the day he was spurred to science at 8 years old, when he met a strange woman with bright gray hair and bright blue eyes, wearing an amulet containing a bright blue gemstone. He wrote, "Clearly, in her late 70s, at least I believed at the time, the mystery woman brought with her an air of ease and inspiration with her joyous laughter. Filled with more beauty inside and out than any clear, blessed day, blazing sunset, or magical starry night have ever mustered for my eyes in all my years. She evoked a reaction from me, and even as a boy I felt humbled and drawn low to the ground as an insect, in awe of her image." Emul and his friend, Tommy, had stopped when they came upon the woman asleep in the weeds on the shoulder of the road. Fearing she was dead, they tried to wake her, and were relieved when she rolled over and smiled. Neither of the boys was frightened of the woman, and after a brief conversation she revealed she was once an angel who had fallen to earth many centuries ago. Tommy had a good laugh, ready to leave, but Emul believed her, entranced by the woman, and wanted to stay. Tommy moved on, while little Francisco and the woman spent the afternoon discussing everything from the alignment of the stars to what made grass green. "Would you like to see something special?" she asked with an affectionate grin after a while. The boy nodded, and the woman proceeded to reveal a mysterious plant from her pack, like nothing the boy had ever seen, brilliant beyond measure, crystalline, nearly translucent, clouded by dazzling lines of color within, vibrant blues and sparkling violets. Mesmerized, Emul was offered a fruit picked from the plant, and gladly accepted it. "Just don't take fruit from anyone else you don't know. Only me. Only this once." He agreed. The fruit was cold and dense, the size of a cherry, and light as air. He popped it into his mouth, and was taken to the limit of the amount of flavor his taste buds could handle. Spicy, sweet, sour, salty, all were present and boundless. Writing the pages years later, Emul still remembered how the cold fruit had made him feel stronger, steady, and unshakable. The professor wrote he grew an inch that day, and swore the plant was responsible for the towering stature he reached as an adult. Standing 6'5", 235 pounds, despite never working out for even an hour, Emul spent his first 60 years as lean and fit as an Olympian. Even as the powers of the fruit faded as he grew old, he remained much healthier than his peers by comparison. Disappearing with her plant on that day, the woman had set herself in young Francisco's mind like nothing else ever would. His desire for another bite of the wondrous fruit would drive nearly every action in his life from then on, and take him across the globe, where he would spend all of his money, just as Leigh had. But in all his decades of searching, Professor Emul never found anything resembling the plant he saw as a child. His career crumbled to dust, and he was left alone. Invalid, near penniless, he spent his days in the park feeding the pigeons, even after back-to-back strokes in his mid-80s. Life, it seemed, had finally caught up with the professor. One day while he watched the birds, unable to throw breadcrumbs any longer, a woman passed by who ignited his memory and sent an old joy sweeping through the man's heart. Even half blind, he knew it was her, the woman who'd offered him the divine fruit as a boy. At 93, he'd become a broken man who looked nothing like he did that day on the side of the road. But she had not aged a bit, now appearing 20 years his junior. In the same moment he saw her, she saw him, and approached his wheelchair, introducing herself as Ilsa. After all these years, she still remembered him, and offered to heal him of his sickness. Emul wrote he nearly laughed, as he was not surprised by the gesture, but politely refused, taking Ilsa by the hand, smiling. "I've lived my life, luckier than most could ever hope to be, and will gladly accept my fate. I'm just happy I got to see you one more time." Feeling he did not possess a threat to her or her kind, Ilsa began visiting the old man once a week, regaling him with stories of the world from which she came. The two formed a friendship, and Ilsa gave her blessing to publish her words in his journal. Despite all odds, defying every word out of his doctor's mouth, Emul lived for another 4 years, mostly bedridden, during which he wrote down the story of his talks with Ilsa. By the time Emul passed, he'd been rejected for publishing 16 times. No one believed the story in the pages. The entries in the journal stopped in April 1897, where Leigh found a clipping, Emul's obituary, dated May 19th. He died in his sleep, found a week later by his building's superintendent. A sad end to a fascinating life, which would not be in vain. Armed with Emul's pages and the perspective they provided, Leigh had more than enough to get started. These creatures of unearth were not from a higher plane of existence. They were aliens invading the planet, and someone had to do something about it. Luckily, one piece of information tucked away in the margins of the notes changed everything. There was a weapon, it seemed, one wielded by humanity, which could turn the tide of the coming war. The sign had arrived. Leigh knew what had to be done. She was going to return to Gehenna. Her watch's alarm went off.
Break's over.
With the pickaxe in hand, she got up and back to work, hoping to get through the breach by nightfall. A buzzing soon came from her pack, another message from Casey. But Leigh could not risk telling the truth. Silence was best.
Have to keep her waiting a little longer.
Leigh put her sat phone away and got back to work. By the time the sun drooped over the sandy hills in the distance, a gap was appearing in the clogged vent. Several times she was forced to hop to safety as the rocks shifted and reorganized. Low-frequency crashes filtered through the vent from whatever was below, which only reinforced her belief she was getting close. As the sun started its final descent, she retrieved 4 solar-powered, yard-high LED towers with tripod legs from the truck, and set up stations on each corner of the rubble pile. Fully charged after resting in the sun all day, they provided around 7 hours of light.
Not much, but worth the effort.
With the area properly illuminated, she rigged up the electric drill. 2 hours into the night portion of the dig, after Leigh switched back to using the pickaxe, a particularly huge boulder gave way and plummeted in front of her. Making a desperate reach with the tool, she snagged a rock ledge and clamped down as hard as she could, holding on for dear life as the ground fell out beneath her. The chunks disappeared into the darkness, eventually crashing with thunderous booms, which rumbled through the pickaxe she was so desperately holding on to. Leigh coughed, covering her face, peering into the hole. The light of her headlamp just grazed the tops of boulders below, at the end of the narrow 50-foot vent. Swinging her right leg, she caught the ledge and was able to pull herself back up. Rolling onto her side, she smiled. The vent was open. It took more than an hour to fix a safe anchor bolt into the rock to belay herself. After tying a double figure-8 knot above the harness, she double-checked her pack and headlamp, swung the pickaxe over her shoulder, and was ready to go. Dropping several flares into the void proved the temple floor was about 80 feet down.
Ish. Doable.
She lowered herself into the darkness, taking her time, feeling as though she were descending into a huge natural well, its walls scalded to a sheer black. A few moments later, the sides of the vent suddenly opened into a vast space as she entered the temple. The half of the room nearest the entrance was filled with rubble and fallen chunks from the walls. Sending her light over the cavern walls told the same story as the vent.
What sort of fire can do this?
As she lowered herself near the plateau, Leigh's headlamp caught the wings of the great creature buried by the collapsed ceiling. Most of the beast was under rubble, out of sight, which was reassuring, though what was showing looked suspiciously intact.
Can only guess what that thing's made of.
Leigh's toes touched down on a broad, flat-faced rock. Once it was tested a dozen times for stability, the belay rope was released. Moonlight poured through the vent above, creating a foggy column at the room's center. Leigh sat for a long while in the dark, soaking up the quiet. Once intimidating, this place no longer had any power over her. Any feelings of consternation were long gone. The temple was expired, and Leigh felt more than ever that what she had come for was nearby. Climbing the mass covering the plateau, which appeared to be the logical place to start looking, she allowed the rocks she stepped on to displace themselves and adjust as needed before moving on, which made the trip up the slope agonizingly slow. Once midway, she swung the pickaxe from over her shoulder and began digging, hitting, and tossing debris for hours on end. When one of the larger rocks was disturbed, it tumbled down the slope, taking many of its peers with it. The ensuing rock slide crept up the rubble pile, forcing Leigh to the safety of the exposed flat top, but she did not mind, as half the work was being done for her. Once the rubble calmed and the last pebble had settled, she found the beast statue had been nearly revealed, its wide, mangled jaw jutting out, filled with rock, as though eating it for breakfast. Clearing the plateau, Leigh eventually looked up the vent and found a deep shade of blue creeping into the blackness of the sky. It would be daytime soon, which was fine with her. She was happy to be down where it would remain cool, and her search could go on indefinitely. The prize would be found. The flat ground of the plateau eventually came into view.
The pedestal's nearby.
Crouching low, shining her headlamp into the nooks and crannies, but seeing nothing but black dust, she adjusted and found a dip large enough to crawl into and shine her light, finding only more dust. As she was about to move on, Leigh noticed something poking into view, a small shape, out of place. She leaned farther, finding it appeared to be a handle.
There!
Her hand flung out, but could not reach it. Hauling rocks away one by one for an additional hour, she finally drew close enough to force her hand through the crevice.
Just a little farther!
Sharp protrusions scraped her arm and stabbed her chest. Skin might have been breaking, but she pushed on. Her fingers wrapped around the object. From the tight, stinging crevice, Leigh withdrew, gripping the Raytheon dagger, which was covered in a fine black powder. Blowing it clean, She gazed at what she'd come all this way to find. The blade, forged from a single piece of charcoal-colored metal, carved with ungodly symbols she was only beginning to understand, was intact, already proving to her the real prize had never been the Gehenna stones themselves, but what had created them in the first place. Joseph had done his research, but had missed the biggest detail of them all.
Devils in them, some say.
True, the brothers of Gehenna were powerful, but too much so. And what use was strength if you had no control over it?
Joe never had control because he never wanted it.
But Leigh did. When she touched the dagger's blade, it drew blood from her finger. Somehow, the edge was as sharp as ever. Sunlight that was beginning to pour through the vent gleamed off the dagger's coarse metal, which she could not help but bask in with reverence.
None of them had any idea.
Even the Raythians knew nothing of what they had in the blade, one of the most powerful weapons in all of Unearth, completely neutral in its charge, capable of amplifying and drawing out the eve of any creature, and bestowing it on the one wielding it. Watching the blood drip down her finger, a smile crept up Leigh's face.
A marvel.
Thank you to everyone who listened this far. The book would not have been possible without the boundless support, advice, and necessary critical abuse of Michelle Kowalski, Allison Taffel, David Hill, Brett Eagleston, Zach Bruning, Adina Cohen, Jeff Delaroy, and Tammy Salyer. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed this first journey through the world of Unearth, and I hope that you'll continue on with me as I release the 6 books planned for the series. I'll see you in Book 2. Take care.